Ukraine left hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers exposed on the front lines without using a single bomb. The Russian army had been continuously stockpiling ammunition for its approximately 130,000 soldiers in northeastern Ukraine from the Belgorod line for a long time. The Ukrainian reconnaissance group was marking critical logistics points in the region to cut off this flow. During the operations, Ukrainian forces made a very interesting discovery beyond the border. Dozens of TM-62 anti-tank mines were detected under two critical bridges in Belgorod. This discovery provided Ukraine with the explosive power it needed, directly with the Kremlin's help. On August 29th, Ukraine blew up two bridges in Belgorod, just across the border, using $600 FPV drones and triggering the TM-62 anti-tank mines hidden by the Russian army under the bridges. Ukrainian sources stated that the first bridge was near Krasny Khutor and that the second was disabled using a similar method. The details of the operation targeting the bridges revealed all the facts. Nearly invisible FPVs capable of carrying 5-10 kilograms of trigger explosives were selected to silently approach the mines discovered under the bridges. FPVs, capable of landing under tunnels where signal interference prevails, were driven to the target and detonated in a way that shattered the superstructure. The 58th Motorized Brigade, which carried out the operation, reported that it disabled both crossings using the same tactic and shared the footage with the public. This was indeed an interesting and noteworthy operation. The Russian side probably did not expect the bridges to be blown up in this way. While explaining the details of the tactic, the Ukrainian side stated that standard reconnaissance UAVs lost connection under the bridges, where electronic jamming was high, and therefore they switched to FPV platforms that could transmit images via fiber optic cable. Once the packages under the bridge piers were detected, a ram was driven into the target, and the secondary explosion of the stacked ammunition collapsed the superstructure. This approach means reducing the cost exponentially by triggering the ready-made explosive at the point where the enemy placed it, rather than hitting the bridges with HIMARS or ballistic ammunition. Moreover, explosives hidden under the bridge create a vulnerability invisible on classic air defense radar screens. The threat seeps through engineering gaps, not radar cross-sections. The footage shows the FPV maneuvering at a wide angle under the culvert, capturing two separate clusters of mines and triggering them with impact. The main scenes of both bridges burning as rubble and steel carcasses confirm that the explosion set off a chain reaction of Russian-made munitions placed there. This was a complete disaster for these Russian units. Because these two crossings were not just concrete arches, they were the final links in the railroad transfers feeding the Vovchansk, Kupiansk, Svatove axis. The two crossings in Belgorod were the bottleneck of the lines descending to the Kharkiv northeast salient via the Veluki station in the north and the Shebekino area in the west. The loading-unloading cycle established in the Belgorod-Valuki-Shebekino triangle operated on a clockwork basis, supplying daily fuel, 122 to 152 millimeters ammunition, and food to the combat elements in the region. Field estimates indicate that the Russian presence holding the Kharkiv and Sumy front lines numbered at least 110 to 130,000 personnel. This included motorized regiments holding Kharkiv's northeast, mixed border mechanized elements facing Sumy, and reinforcement units rotating on the Kursk line. This military scale multiplies daily consumption, because hundreds of vehicles pass through these lines every day. A mechanized battalion burns 8 to 12,000 liters of fuel per day. A single 152mm battery requires 150-plus rounds on a busy day. Armored route security requires a patrol and EW node every 10 to 15 kilometers. Closing the bridges means cutting off this consumption from local supply. In other words, this oversight by the Russian army cuts off support for its soldiers from their own territory, leaving approximately 130,000 Russian soldiers in the middle of hell. In other words, the Kremlin had left its own army helpless with its own mines. Another critical point is that this tactic is not a one-off surprise, but a repeatable concept. If you stack spare explosives under a bridge, the other side can also spot that stack, detonate it on your behalf, and charge you for the cost. This means the Ukrainian army can do this not only in Belgorod, but also in different cities across Russia. However, Russia's main focus right now is on the two bridges it lost in Belgorod. This is because these arteries are strategically important for the Russian army. Railroad transfer areas, pallet crate transfer from rail to truck, short-range air defense and EW nodes protecting this. The moment the bridges are cut, train convoys cannot be unloaded at planned stations. Trucks have to take detours, escort plans are extended, and fuel costs increase. The cliché, one bridge closes, another opens, does not work in war logistics, because the new route is longer, more visible, and becomes more predictable for the reconnaissance strike chain. This is what Ukraine is looking for. The narrowing bottleneck turns its own rhythm into a target. Winter and terrain conditions increase fragility. The low valleys in the Oskil-Sayum basins, fog and icing shorten the lifespan of temporary bridges. The pace of pontoon battalion rotations increases. Alternative routes from Belgorod to Kharkiv-Sumy. The rail culvert bridge triangles around Valuiki and Shebekino. Each represent a new target area. As Ukraine erodes the crossings, it imposes the artillery FPV drone trio on these forced detours. Thus, not only are two bridges delayed, but an entire month's flow is delayed. For over 100,000 Russian troops, this means a shortened ammunition fuel food cycle. A short cycle means a choice between retreating or suffering more losses. On the other hand, another factor that has hit the Russians hardest is that Ukraine has carried out these attacks at a very reasonable cost. The unit cost of the drones used in the attacks on the bridges ranges from 25,000 to 30,000 hryvnia. That is roughly equivalent to between $600 and $725. This figure is a fraction of the price of a single precision-guided missile. And as a result, the low-cost, high-impact equation worked in Ukraine's favor. The salient details of the attack were reported in the same vein in mainstream media and OSINT channels. The message was clear. Low-cost platforms, when combined with good reconnaissance, can lock down strategic infrastructure. Therefore, the attack was not only an engineering failure, but also a lesson in deterrence measured in monetary terms. When the Russian army attempts to compensate for this loss with temporary bridges, it will require additional units for bridgehead protection and mine clearance. This could reduce the unit capacity of the Russian army along the line. Since alternative routes are longer and more visible, new ambush windows could emerge for FPVs of the same caliber or fixed-wing kamikaze UAVs. Moreover, losing two bridges on the same day sends a message to Russian units in the field that their lines are exposed, triggering a behavioral shift toward avoiding large movements. This behavioral shift divides the Russian army's supply rhythm into smaller convoys. More convoys mean more time and more targets. This doubles the financial burden on Russia's defense side, because more sorties and driver escort hours are needed to deliver the same tonnage to the front. So, at the operational level, we are talking about a scenario where not just one bridge, but a chain has been weakened. Therefore, the phrase two bridges means not only the narrowing of two separate choke points in war logistics, but also the disruption of the entire rhythm. On the other hand, the Belgorod area is not only a place where logistics arteries have been cut by UAV attacks, but it has also become a showcase, in a test capacity, for Moscow's narrative of rear security from a psychological and political perspective. Repeated explosions 20 to 50 kilometers deep inside the border are leading to the normalization of sirens and flight cancellations in city centers. This situation tests the risk communication and crisis management capacity of the civilian administration every week, while also consuming municipal and state budgets alongside the military. Even the installation of anti-drone nets on the facades of public buildings in Belgorod creates more of a visibility management effect than solving the problem. The net may delay a quadcopter's dive, but what is really being read at the perception level is the image of the city covering itself with a shield. Meanwhile, the Russian Defense Ministry announces that dozens of UAVs have been shot down on different days in Belgorod, and emphasizes that a continuous watch regime is in place in the airspace. Even if these reports are accurate, the cycle created by the consumption of defense ammunition and personnel patrols is generating fatigue along the Belarus-Bryansk-Kursk-Belgorod line. This fatigue translates into fluctuating delays in Russian tanker and supply lines, which in turn lead to periodic spikes in retail fuel and food prices. Consequently, Moscow's internal security rhetoric is put to the test every week by images coming from the border regions. For its part, Russia has implemented layered defense and temporary restrictions against increased UAV pressure throughout the summer to avoid failing this test. The Russian Air Defense Command announced that dozens of UAVs were shot down on many nights. Intense activity was reported over Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk. Some nights, dozens of UAVs were reported destroyed in the same window. In this scenario, urban flight restrictions and temporary bans on civilian airports were also implemented. Electronic warfare nodes were increased to detect and suppress drones. Physical barriers and patrols were intensified at Russia's critical facilities. Nevertheless, low-altitude, short-range, and inexpensive platforms continued to overwhelm all layers. The low-cost threat is creating a unit-cost nightmare for defense. The Belgorod bridges case was a striking example of this imbalance. The question of whether defense measures in border cities are sufficient to protect logistics is now more critical. Flight restrictions and defense measures announced by Russian authorities were frequently updated alongside waves of attacks. This situation imposed additional administrative costs on civil-military flows. On some days, airport operations were temporarily suspended. GPS jamming and signal degradation were used to disrupt drone routes. However, as confirmed by local authorities, infrastructure traffic faltered during periods of intense activity. The concept of secure corridors on roads and railways was retested with each series of attacks. Meanwhile, Ukraine's arsenal of attack tools, which has caused panic in Russia and led to all the changes we have described in the country, is based on a strategy combining expensive and inexpensive elements. Long-range kamikaze types, modular FPVs, and industrial-class platforms are used together. Reports on the UJ-22 and domestic Beaver-class systems point to long-range and autonomy. High-volume swarm formations are seen in raids targeting industrial facilities. Open sources have reported waves of UAVs being sent to defense industry targets. Details have also been shared about long-distance launches from mobile shelter-covered transportable ramps. This diversity prevents Russian defenses from solving the problem with a single countermeasure. Each subsystem requires a different detection window and a different suppression method. Cheap FPVs, on the other hand, wear down the defense through sheer numbers. In the Belgorod bridges case, it was precisely these cheap UAV plans that produced a strategic impact. In addition to Belgorod, Ukraine's strategic target set also includes Russia's capital and major metropolises. Russia has announced that it has shot down many UAVs around Moscow and St. Petersburg in recent months. Air defense and electronic warfare nodes have been tightened along the coast and inland. It has been claimed that dozens of UAVs were shot down simultaneously on some nights. Physical barriers and patrols have been increased in critical areas in major cities, particularly Moscow and St. Petersburg. Nevertheless, platforms with extended range continue to challenge deterrence and detection layers. In this environment, the soft underbelly is often the main supply routes and bridges. This is also where Kiev has the most advantage in the cost-effectiveness equation. Therefore, these two important Russian cities are also under threat from Ukrainian attacks. The importance of Moscow and St. Petersburg for Kiev is not only symbolic, but also related to their operational warning function. Any attack alert from the centers could lead to the withdrawal of defense systems. This can cause the layers at the border and front line to thin out from time to time. This thinning at critical bridges and junctions can create gaps in protection. Ukraine therefore aims to undermine the confidence of the Russian regime, not only in Belgorod, but also in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Russia's response to this can be interpreted as engineering in the short term, shuttle diplomacy in the medium term, and re-establishing lines in the long term. In the short term, pontoon temporary bridges can be set up under air defense cover and EW umbrella. The personnel fuel material bill for this is hefty. In the medium term, convoys can be shifted further north or south to try to maintain rhythm. This means more hours on the road and more waiting behind the front lines. In the long term, projects for new routes can be discussed. However, they will be hampered by sand and waterways, property rights, and money. The statement that hundreds of UAVs were shot down in defense communications is a tactical success. But a single gap under the bridge can change the strategic picture of that night. Therefore, air defense ammunition and maintenance schedules must be addressed in the same table as the weaknesses in the bridge-tunnel-rail triangle. Otherwise, the cost of two bridges will be visible both in the budget and on the map at the end of the month. In other words, it is not impossible for Ukraine to carry out an attack similar to the one organized in Belgorod in Moscow. As partial lockdowns in Moscow and St. Petersburg continue, public pressure will raise the question of why here and why now more loudly. The networks in Belgorod, the barriers in Kursk, and the patrols in Bryansk may not be enough to lower the threat perception. Then the defense rhetoric may have to be supported by tougher internal security measures. This could bring economic and social costs. The two bridges in Belgorod are seen as part of a plan that is not limited to Kiev targeting Moscow or St. Petersburg as central objectives, but which complements that pressure. If border logistics stumble somewhere every week for a month, the pressure on the front lines will be felt directly. This pressure could lead to more efficient use of artillery and drones in the defense-offense balance around Kharkiv, or even the trimming of certain protrusions. Replacing the bridge could take weeks, repairing the transformer station days, and repairing the rail junction hours. However, if all three coincide in the same week, defense planning could become overly saturated. This overload, combined with delays and closures in the civilian sphere, can increase public pressure. As public pressure mounts, political centers may turn to demonstrations of force that can deliver quick results. These demonstrations are costly and have limited sustainability. Thus, low-cost attacks may continue to generate high-cost defensive reflexes. This is why the narrative of the bridges is significant, because it reveals how the daily log of the war is being written. Looking back at the first scene, two pieces of information stand out. The bridges were disabled by Russian forces triggering their own mines, and the vehicles that did this were not $100,000 missiles but FPVs costing less than $1,000. Even if reports of numerous Russian UAVs being shot down are accurate, these two bridge sites were where gaps in the defense on the ground and the aggressor's flexible tactics converged. Flight delays in major cities and rooftop defenses are another facet of this pressure. Depth and border continue to burn on the same night. Belgorod's networks and urban barriers alone are not enough to reduce the perceived threat, because a small platform descending under a bridge may not even appear as a dot on the radar screen. If Ukraine continues along this line, the rhythm in the bridge rail transformer triangle will be disrupted, and the cost curve will continue to turn against the defense. The defense's response to this could be faster repairs, smarter camouflage, and more disciplined ammunition management. Otherwise, each new week could bring new costs. Belgorod's two bridges made all these lessons visible in a single night. The strategy of beating the expensive with the cheap is not just a tactical trick, but a pressure architecture capable of altering a year's plan. This architecture, combined with delays in Moscow and St. Petersburg, creates a constant state of alarm economy across the country. And the long game of war is often won or lost on the sustainability of this alarm economy. Ultimately, the two bridges in Belgorod are not a one-night sabotage operation, but a hand pressed on the pulse of the Northeast Front. And the fuel, ammunition, and food for over 100,000 Russian soldiers were simultaneously put on hold. The Kremlin struck its own army with its own TM-62s stacked under the bridges. Thank you for watching.